Today at Speedy's Garage, I'm going to show you something a little different. I don't play a lot of video games, but as you guys know, I do edit a lot of HD video, and Old Faithful here was getting to be on our last leg. I built this system probably 8 years ago. It's had a few upgrades along the way, like some SSD drives. I've upgraded the processor, upgraded the memory. One motherboard failed, and I replaced it and rebuilt it. I got something inexpensive off of eBay. Now that motherboard is also starting to fail. And once the motherboard starts to go out, you're better off to just build a new system pretty much, especially if it's older like this one is. This system started life as one of the older i5 750 class processor systems. I later upgraded it to an i7 870, I think was the model number, to get a little bit more horsepower out of it. I didn't find that to really make that much of a difference on the video editing or rendering for some reason. It might be a limitation of Sony Vegas Movie Studio, which is what I personally use. So this time I went with an i5 again, and we'll just overclock it like I did this one for the extra performance. The parts when doing something like this are pretty straightforward. I got a new motherboard, which is the Asus Z170-A. It got pretty good reviews online. Like I said, I do not game, so I wasn't really worried about all the SLI and multiple graphics cards and all of that. What I was really more interested in were the USB connections, the SATA connections for your hard drives and things of that nature, as well as the RAID features for the hard drive redundancy. Like I said, I went with a Core i5 processor again. This is one of the K series, which means it is unlocked. It's the 6600. The unlocked ones are easier to overclock, and it's kind of like supercharging your car. You can get quite a bit of performance out of a processor, much more so than what they come with standard, with just a few tweaks on the motherboard. And it's free horsepower. I went with some Corsair Vengeance DDR4 3200 memory, a couple of 2 terabyte Western Digital black hard drives, and these will be in a RAID 1, which means they're mirrors of each other. So whatever gets written to one is automatically written to the other one, and if you have a hard drive failure, you don't have any data loss. I'm going with a 500 gig SSD drive for the operating system and a data storage space for my documents and things of that nature. There's one in the old system that I'm going to use along with this. It's the exact same model and same size, and those will also be in a RAID 1 for redundancy. The centerpiece to the system, and something new for me, is this water-cooled unit that I picked up from Corsair to keep the processor cool. When you overclock them, they pick up quite a bit more heat, just like supercharging a car picks up more heat. So you have to get rid of it. This thing is a self-contained, liquid-cooled unit with a radiator. Came with a couple of 120 millimeter fans and a nice copper water block with a built-in pump to take the heat away from the processor. It includes some pretty cool features like integration into the motherboard, and it has a built-in software package to monitor temperatures of the coolant as well as the processor, as well as a USB connection for more data. It comes with a nice hardware package with the necessary hold downs for the motherboard and the processor. The case is one area you want to take your time and make sure you get one that has all of the features that you want and is at the right price point. Cases vary greatly in those two areas. I picked the Intermax Ostrog. It got very good reviews. The specs were everything I wanted to have. It's got plenty of ventilation. I liked that it had the microphone, USB regular, USB 3.0 connections at the top. It's got a LED fans with the ability to turn the lights off and on the LEDs, which I like that. A lot of them don't have that. The side window is kind of cool. You can see what's going on inside the computer when it's running with the lights and whatnot. Bottom mounted power supply. It's also got a cutout in the bottom with a filter to draw in cool air. 120 millimeter area for exhaust fans, plenty of space for add-ons. The front intake fans are 140 millimeter, so that means they'll be a little bit more quiet than your standard 120. To open the case, it's a couple of thumb screws on the back. And the only thing I've found about this case that I really wasn't wild about is they don't have these captive. In other words, they will actually come completely off the side panel. Some cases these days will actually hang on to this so you don't have the likelihood of losing it. I wish this one did, but that's a very small complaint. And with the sides removed, we can start getting ready to work with it. Another reason I chose this case was its diversity. It's got a SSD cage built in. It's got thumb screws holding it to the bottom of the case. However, one of these larger 3.5 drive bays will actually come out, and now you can mount the SSD drive cage up here right in front of the fans so it gets cool air. And that's what I'm going to do, because I won't need all of these This case is what they also call toolless for the most part, which means it uses these little sliders to go on your drives to get them installed in the drive shelves. Plenty of screws for your motherboard, power adapters if needed, speaker, and it even included zip ties, which kind of surprised me, to help you tidy up your cables when you were done. In order to get this done, you're really only going to need 2 tools, some small snips, and a Phillips head screwdriver. A lot of people think assembling computers is black magic. I'm going to show you that it's really more like Legos.
We're going to start by installing the power supply. It's very simple. This particular one mounts in the bottom of the case using 4 screws. And pretty much everything else related is just cable management, running the peripheral cables, the power cables, and things of that nature in an organized fashion. Next, we install the hard drive cages, followed by the motherboard. I always use all of the screws to mount the motherboard to the case to ensure a good ground source where needed. Finally, just connect up all of your wires, including USB headers, fan headers, power, front switch port, hard drives, etc.
Things are a little bit different since the last time I built a system. My motherboard included a CPU installation tool. And this is the CPU, it's kind of the brain of the system. And on the installation tool there's a mark in the bottom right-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner you're looking at it. And it's a triangle that matches up with a gold triangle that's on your CPU. And that indicates pin number 1. You want to line those 2 items up, and then you snap your CPU into the installation tool until it clicks. And then insert your CPU into the motherboard. And you'll notice there's a mark on the motherboard denoting where the triangle should go. And finally, lock down the holding clamp. And as you're securing it, you can remove the cap. Make sure the holder goes underneath the set screw and lock it in place. And you'll notice the installation tool stayed with the CPU and the motherboard. Now we've installed the memory, which is much easier and less complex than the CPU. The CPU wasn't hard, but you have to be a little careful, it's a little tedious. Pay attention to the pins on the memory, because one side's longer than the other, and you need to line that up with your mark on the motherboard, or your slot on the motherboard rather. And these are paired sets, so they color code them. You got black and gray. So if you're only doing 2 sticks like I am, you want to make sure you match them up in the proper color. And I did a 16 gigabyte kit, which is 2 8 gigabyte sticks. When you hear the click, they've locked into place. Next, we're going to install the Corsair water cooler. Take a look at the parts, and this is for an Intel system. These are for the radiator and fan. These are for the water block that goes on top of the processor. And mine's an 1151 socket, so I'm going to use this one. The kit included 3 separate types of screws, so I'm glad they included a picture. That's pretty standard for Corsair. I found their stuff to be very high quality. These are obviously for a different socket than I have. They have the short end on them. I'm going to use these for, so those are for mine, 1151. So those are the ones I'm going to use. You'll also notice the hold down backing plate is set up to work with either type of motherboard. So you want to move the small threaded adapter down into the bottom corner if you're using an 1151 motherboard like I am, so it should look like this when it's ready to be installed. Another nice thing about this case is they left an opening so that you could access the motherboard mounting plate from the back without having to remove the motherboard from the case. It makes it handy if you're doing upgrades or changing things in the future. And this backing plate just pops into place. I'll say it does. Once you get the holes lined up, there we go. And now we'll install our standoffs on the front. They appear to be the same length, so I don't think it matters which end goes on the backing plate. So I'm just going to install them the way I pick them up and hope it's right. Now I need to remove the 120 millimeter fan that was included with the case, because the Corsair water cooling kit includes its own fans, and they're very high quality from what I've read. And the next thing you need to think about is the direction of airflow. And all fans, or at least good ones, are marked on the side telling you, there it is. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's marked telling you the fan's gonna turn counterclockwise and that direction of airflow is this direction. So I'm gonna set this up so that it pulls air through the top of the case, down and across that radiator and out the back. So it's gonna be an exhaust fan. I'm gonna turn it so that the power cable is in a bottom orientation. You use the included screw with a washer to go through the fan and then into the radiator. And it's probably gonna be a little bit tedious. This is one of those times it'd probably be handy if I had a third arm. And this is all aluminum, the fan housing included, so don't over tighten it, just till it's snug. The fins are also aluminum, or at least they're a soft material. I shouldn't say they're aluminum because I don't know that for sure, but they're a soft material, so you want to be careful with the fins on the radiator as well, don't bend them. That's what we end up with it mounted. Now we need to put the intake fan on the other side in the same method. Now we can install the water block. And you'll notice it's already got thermal paste pre-installed. And you want to tighten these like you would lug nuts on a car, cross pattern. And don't over tighten, just snug them down. And after cross-checking everything, I'm going to go ahead and tighten them until the thumb screws seat firmly against the standoffs. And finally, come in and connect the fan header to your CPU fan connector on the motherboard. That's how it's going to monitor RPM and temperature, and then connect your two power cables from your fans to the connector on the harness. And if you want to be able to use the Corsair software to monitor and control the unit, you can connect the USB cable to the pump and then to a USB header on the motherboard. Now obviously I'll tidy up these wires a little bit as we bring the rest of the cabling in, zip tie them together to make them look a little bit nicer, and probably hide these back here like that. But that's what you end up with for that water-cooled setup, and that's actually, I think that's pretty slick. It's self-contained, and I'll show some better pictures of it when it's actually running. I did it for two reasons. I figured this is gonna give me better cooling, and I'm gonna overclock this processor, and it's gonna need the cooling ability, and also it should be more quiet. These are be controlled by temperature, and with water having a higher coefficient for energy than air, it can absorb, in other words, it can absorb more energy off of the processor. These fans shouldn't have to run as fast as if I had an air-cooled setup, so it should be much more quiet. And this is one of the reasons I decided to give that Corsair water cooling rig a try. Modern processors get hotter and hotter as the transistors get smaller and smaller, and they pack more of them onto the chip. And for air cooling, you need a giant heat exchanger to draw the heat off the processor in order to be efficient. And they're just getting so big and heavy, I decided I would try the water out. Years ago, I built my own water cooling unit, and it was very, very effective. And it was basically made with plumbing parts and an aquarium pump and a copper block. And it allowed me to overclock a processor back in the day to like 17 or 1800 megahertz, when the fastest you could buy at the time was 1000 megahertz. So that really showed me it was quite efficient. So I'm hoping this Corsair unit will be just as good. When you say a case is toolless, a lot of what they're referring to is how you insert your drives and whatnot. They come with these rails like I showed you earlier. They just snap onto the hard drive like that, and then you just slide the hard drive into the cage. There you go. So here's the setup I plan to run as far as the drives go. As I said before, I've got the two SSDs. They will be in a RAID 1, which means they are mirrors of each other to give redundancy. So if one of these fails, I'll still have system functionality through the other one. I can replace the failed one, and then it will just recopy or mirror itself back onto the new one after I replace the failed drive. Same with these two. These are the 2 terabyte drives. They will be for data storage. They will also be in a RAID 1, so they're mirrors of each other. These two will be for performance, and they're what's called a RAID 0, which means they're a stripe. So a little bit of data gets written to this one, and a little bit of data gets written to this one. So the data stripes across them. So as you can see, that you basically double your performance because you're striping across them. This will be where I do the video encoding. So they'll probably start with the source files from here, from this RAID array, and then they'll write to this RAID array, which is a RAID 0 for performance. And then this up here will be for the redundancy, like I said. I didn't want to use SSDs for these because the video writing and reading, it's a lot of read writes. And SSDs, while they will last a very long time, they are susceptible to read-write block failure. So over time, the more you read and write from an SSD, it basically wears it out. Now, it'll probably take it 5 or 10 years under normal use, but with video encoding with so much data flowing through them, it could shorten the life. These drives are still pretty cheap, and these are 2 terabyte and these are 1 terabyte each. These are 2 terabyte each, so it just made more sense to go that route. And as you can see, I tried to color code the cables. So these are the 2 RAID 1 drives that are 2 terabyte. The red are gonna be the 2 RAID 0 drives, which are 1 terabyte each. And then of course the orange are the SSDs. It just makes things easier when you're looking at where your connections are going. One other nice thing about this case is your 5 1/4 drive bays are also toolless. And I've got a 3.5 inch multi-card reader that I've put into a 5 1/4 drive tray. And then you literally just slide it in and it locks into place. And that's all there is to it. And the last thing I need to do is get all of that into there in an orderly fashion. And now it just becomes an exercise of trying to route these in a way that makes sense and that is neat and tidy. I started with the hard drives, so these are going to need power from one of these cables. So I tried to separate it from the rest and went ahead and powered those 4 up. So now those are good. The next thing I need to do is get main power, which is a 24 pin connector, over to the motherboard. Now keep in mind, the other half of the case will go over here, and so a lot of these will be hidden, thank goodness. These are additional power supply leads for the motherboard. And the last thing I need to do is power the 2 SSD drives. So that means some of these will have to be hidden somehow. So there's what I came up with on the backside as far as cable management goes. And you'll find some guys online that are really deep into this stuff. They go nuts with cable management, almost like I do with wiring in a car. But honestly, as long as it's hidden and tucked out of the way and not crimped or bent, I'm happy. And with these zip ties, you want to make sure that they're loose so that the cables aren't pinched. Looser is better. I just have them very loosely secured to hold them out of the way. And on the side of the case that you're actually going to see through the window, it's quite a bit neater because everything's hidden on the back side. Now we're ready to install the sides of the case and fire it up and see how it does. I'm going to start with the front of the case. And something else I wanted to point out was that they actually put filters over the 5 1/4 drive bay slots, as well as a great big filter over where the 140 millimeter fans are. I've got to open one of these because I've got the card reader in place. And now this just pops back on. Now I'm going to do the side that has all the cables, because it's probably going to be the most difficult. This panel they extruded, left plenty of room for all the cables behind the back plate of the motherboard. And finally, the window side, I always check it to make sure it's latched. It's got little clips on the edges here. I like that they put a protective sheet over the glass to make sure it didn't get scratched. The last thing we need to do is install our panel cover. Okay, I made a slight mistake in assuming that I could slip this plate between the motherboard and the case with the motherboard in place. It wouldn't fit, so I had to take the screws out of the motherboard and slide this back just a little bit in order to get that plate in place, but it's all fixed now and I'm putting the screws for the motherboard back in now. Not a big deal, but something to be aware of if you're following along. And there's where we ended up with assembly. I'm really happy with that Ostrog case. It's got a tray up top for memory cards and whatnot, plenty of ventilation for cooling, lots of options. I think it's gonna work out great. Now we just need to fire it up, make sure it works, and get the operating system installed. On the first fire up of a new system, always keep it really simple, minimal connections, just mouse and keyboard, video. Don't forget your power, and don't forget to actually turn the power switch on. Now that we've got everything hooked up, I'm going to power the system on. And I usually like to go into the BIOS right off the bat when a new system boots up. And there's a little message down here that tells you if you hit the delete key or F2, you'll go into the UEFI BIOS. That's where you can change all of the baseline settings on the motherboard. And there we go. So we've got some CPU RPMs, or fan RPMs rather, CPU fan RPMs, the chassis fans. Here's all the hard drives, it lists those out. There's a status of our memory, that looks good. This time is wrong, so we need to fix that. This is military time, so it'll be 16:57 for 4:57 p.m. Now we're gonna go in F11, I believe. So you got a couple of options here. They're telling us the frequency of our processor, 3500 megahertz, which is what I would expect. Frequency of our RAM, which is also what I would expect, but I'm more interested in setting up RAID. I want to get those drives set up before I put the operating system on. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. This is getting into some pretty advanced stuff. There's a lot of how-to videos that'll be much more thorough on YouTube, but bottom line is I'm going to go into here, tell it I want to enable RAID, and then I'm going to set those RAID drives up as RAID 1 and RAID 0 as I discussed previously. So the system rebooted, went back into the menu, and now it's asking me which ports we want to select. All of my drives are SATA. I'm going to select that. And like I said, I'm not going to bore you with all the boring details. I'm just going to go through this, and if you really want to know how to do it, just look it up on YouTube. So now we're ready to put our operating system on. So we'll just reboot, and nowadays you do it all through, get on the screen there, USB key. So you go online, I'm gonna do Windows 10 on this machine. There's a tool you download from Microsoft. You obviously have to have another computer to do this. You point it at a thumb drive like this and you tell it where it's gonna locate the install. Then you have to have the Windows ISO, grabs that, makes you a boot key to do your operating system install. I've never done it before, so let's see how that goes. So I plug the USB key in, one of the USB 3.0 connections. It's only gonna connect at 2.0, but that's all the USB key would support, but I still wanted in one of the fastest connections on the system. During system startup, I just hit F8, that gets you into the boot menu. Now we're gonna select the USB key. You can see it flashing up there, that means it's reading it. It should take us into operating system install screen, I hope. We're gonna pick we know it's a 500 gigabyte SSD drive, so that's the one I'm gonna select. So now this will just have to run through its process. I'm not sure how long it'll take. I've never installed one from USB key before, so we'll just let this roll. One thing I did want to mention while we're waiting for the operating system to install is I always check to make sure the motherboard has the latest BIOS installed on it before I do anything. This one did, it was version 1801. I went out to the ASUS website to see if there was a later version, and there was not. So make sure you do that if you're building one from scratch. And then there'll be drivers and firmware and other type of things we're going to install, but we'll do that after the operating system is on there. So it ran through its first round of the installation procedure. It took about 10 minutes, which is much faster than I'm used to on the older system. And it's just gone through its first reboot. So let's see what it does when it comes back up. That's basically it. The next thing I always do is go in and set my hard drives up, and you do that through your storage disk management interface. I set up the primary storage drive as a 2 terabyte RAID 1, gave it an E drive letter. This is the main system drive, that's the 2 SSDs. Windows 10 by default gives you a 450 megabyte, at least on this drive. Looks like it does 10% maybe of the drive as a reserve, a health system partition of 100 megabyte. Obviously we got the operating system here. I gave it about 275 gigabytes, and then I saved the rest, the 200 gig, for data. Now this will be for operating system and programs. Always reserve this area for my documents and things of that nature. That way if I ever have a problem with the operating system and have to reinstall it, I know my documents and everything else are safe. Windows 10 is probably a little bit smarter than older operating systems and will give you the option to keep those, but I'd rather play it safe than sorry. Finally, we got the RAID 0 that'll be our performance drive for dumping our videos during render. And if you go over to File Explorer, that's kind of what it ends up looking like. So we can get rid of this because it's all done. And you end up with a C, D, E, and F drive. And you may have noticed some of those other ones. I'll show you this real quick. This is how you get to your disk manager. You'll see a lot of more drive letters on mine. You've got a disk 4, removable W, X, Y, and Z. That's actually this guy. So those are the removable drives. It reserves drive letters for those, even though there's no disk plugged in. I always take my USB ports that have the smart card or SSDs or whatever else they are, compact flash, SD, mini, etc. And I start at Z and work backwards. And so that way these are out of the way. And I usually do the same thing back in the day with the CD-ROM drives. I would kind of give a very high drive letter just to get them out of the way as well. So that's really all there is to building a computer. A lot of people that I've talked to think it's black magic for some reason, but it's really more like Legos, like you saw. The parts only plug together one way, pretty easy to do. I think that water cooling unit's gonna work out nice. It's real quiet, which is what I was looking for. I did look at laptops as a solution before I built this one. The problem with the laptops were that the ones that had the powerful enough processor for the HD video editing and rendering that I do, they were so expensive, and then you're really kind of locked in. So you buy that laptop and it comes with an i7 or whatever, new i5. You can't really upgrade it. There's no real upgrade path for those laptops. And they were probably 2 or maybe even 3 times what it cost me to build this machine. Won't have the storage and won't have the speed that this one will have. I'll probably come back and show you a little bit of how I might overclock it. I'll get into that later. What I always do is get the system 100% set up and stable. I'll get all my applications installed, printer hooked up, scanner hooked up, all of that working. Let the system burn in for a few days to make sure I'm not gonna have any problems with it. And then I'll start slowly increasing the speed on it and get that overclock going. So once I get the system burned in, everything's set up on it, I'll show you that. Last thing I did before I shut off my old system is ran a full backup of any data that I needed to an external. This is a terabyte Western Digital passport drive, but anything will work that's big enough for your data. Windows backup, I'm going to restore that data to this machine, get Microsoft Office installed, get it on the internet, make sure it's got virus protection, yada, yada, yada on there. And then, like I said, let it burn in for a little while, and then I'll come back and show you guys how to overclock it.